Yeah. Look at you people. That's right. How are you? I'll preach it. Can I get an amen? Amen. Preach. All right. Nice start. Well, we live in complex times. We have ROBOA, ECMO, EPR. It's a fascinating time to be a resuscitationist. If you listen really closely at this conference, you're going to hear the word complex and complexity thrown around a lot. And I think the reason for that is because the more we learn about critical illness, the more we learn how complex resuscitation actually can be. And with that comes the need to manage and constrain complexity. Because when things get really complicated, ultimately it's our ability to simplify and organize problems that's going to see us through. So this is Pompeii by a German-born abstract impressionist painter named Hans Hofmann. Hofmann famously said that the ability to simplify means to eliminate the unnecessary so that the necessary may speak. Now, complex isn't just more of something, it's different. And changing the scale of a problem means changing the rules. For example, this is a googol. It's a gigantic number, 10 to the power of 100. But it's not that complex, despite the fact that it's large. You compare that to this. This is a 9-digit prime number. Much more complex, even though it's a lot smaller, because it can't be factored down any further from its surface complexity. This is something called Kolmogorov complexity, which is the complexity of an entity is defined as the minimum number of bits of data required to describe that thing without losing information on it. This is your next patient. 22-year-old female, unbelted driver in a motor vehicle collision. And she's partially ejected through the windshield of her car, which is a good thing because before she was extricated, the car burst into flames. And she arrives at your hospital wildly agitated. She has no palpable blood pressure, bad facial smash injury, burns about her head, neck, and torso, a presumed right-sided flail segment in her chest, a mechanically unstable pelvis. And when you ultrasound her abdomen, you recognize that she is well into the 3rd trimester of a pregnancy. So you can practically hear people's butt cheeks slamming shut when a case like that walks through the door. That's the sound that butt cheeks make when they slam shut, in case you were wondering. So what we need to figure out in the next 15 minutes or so is what an abstract impressionist painting, a googol, and a complex trauma resuscitation have in common. And there is a really fascinating convergence when you read in the domains of philosophy and art and design, mathematics, economics, about the importance of simplifying complex problems that I don't think is a coincidence. Steve Jobs said of complexity that simple can be harder than complex because you have to get your thinking straight first. And that's what we're talking about here. Because if you want Keep It Simple to be more than just a platitude, then you need a strategy. A pick list of organizational and behavioral hacks that's going to help you get with the science of simplicity. So we're going to talk about 4. The strength of habit, how to foster emergent organization within teams, the ability to factor down complex problems, and ways to limit variables during uncertain periods. So first on habit. Charles Noble said of habit, first we make our habits, and then our habits make us. And good or bad, habits have a lot to do with whether or not we succeed at a given enterprise. When I was in high school, I really wanted to meet girls at parties, but I was nervous and socially awkward, so I made it my habit to drink so much alcohol that I vomited out my own nostrils. That was a bad example, I suppose. The interesting thing about habits is they can break down complex problems into their more simple and constituent parts. And the interesting thing about that is that once a habit has been practiced and rehearsed sufficiently, when exposed to the appropriate cues, it becomes more difficult not to execute a habit than it is to execute it. And habits are different from goals, because goals tend to emphasize the end point in a process without really considering the constituent steps along the way. So for example, I could say, I want to learn all 3 of the Gershwin piano preludes in 6 months, which is a goal. It's not going to happen. Or I could make it my habit to practice piano 20 minutes a day. And I'm much more likely to get to my goal by way of those specific habits than simply by virtue of the goal itself. So in a complex resuscitation like this, I might say, oh my God, my goal is to save this patient, and she's pregnant too. I have to save both of them. Or I could say, my habit is to approach a hypotensive trauma patient in the same way each and every time so that I don't miss anything. And this comes up in performance athletics quite frequently when coaches emphasize the importance of process over outcome. Because not only does that simplify and constrain the complexity of the act that needs to be performed, but it also tends to put athletes at a better point on the performance arousal curve so that they can actually execute when the time comes. And it may sound like I'm emphasizing an overly rigid approach to this, but I actually think it's the opposite. My belief is that situation awareness as a concept is a relative term. You have to know your position on the road before you can start to appreciate your position relative to other objects. And so having a habit or a routine or a consistent way of doing things actually puts you and your team in a better position to detect outliers and variants and atypical features that are so common in complex scenarios. So, for example, in a situation like this, I think it's really important, despite all the complexities of the patient, to make sure your team doesn't make wild variances in their habit, particularly during the primary trauma survey, simply because the patient is pregnant or has burns. That can come later. Okay, once you've figured out habit, it's time to move on to fostering emergent organization with teams. And this is a complex idea in and of itself. But what emergence really refers to is a process of self-organization in teams and groups whereby individual simplicity can create organized complexity. And that concept is felt to underpin everything from how individual neurons can come together to create intelligence, to swarm behavior, or perhaps most famously, how starlings flock in the sky. Has anyone ever seen this? Thousands of starling birds can gather in the sky and move with this remarkable complexity of movement that far exceeds the complexity of each individual member of the group. This is the definition of the sum is greater than its parts. And if you tried to model this and predict this behavior using a computer algorithm, you would invariably lose accuracy over time because you couldn't possibly account for all of the variables in that larger complex group. But to view the problem from the perspective of emergence theory, you could instead say, let's try and predict behavior of the group simply by looking at the behavior of the individual members and their interactions with one another, and then let the complexity emerge from there. So with a group of starlings, you might say really 3 things. Okay, generally speaking, fly in the same direction as other birds in your cone of vision. Don't collide with other birds, but stay close enough to the birds that are near you so you have some protection from predators. Alignment, separation, cohesion. And when you apply those rules to a larger group of starlings, you get this. This remarkable complexity of movement that far exceeds that of the individual members of the group, and the group is just responding to 3 simple rules. So you may now be saying, dude, did I walk into an ornithology lecture? Why are we talking about birds? I think this has implications for how you set up your team to respond to complexity. So this is your standard trauma team setup in a functional team organization. Team leader on the top, bunch of team members underneath, orthopedics over in the timeout chair because they wouldn't stop screwing with the pelvis, even though we asked them not to. During periods of high task load and decision overhead, I think it makes a lot of sense to reorganize your team under more divisional lines, which means you create mini-teams or sub-teams, semi-autonomous units of your team that function independently for set periods of time during the resuscitation towards a specific goal. And when you do this, whether you recognize it or not, you're fostering the strength of emergent organization in groups. So for example, you may take, in this case, 2 or 3 members of the team and devote them towards airway management. And as a team leader, you'd have that discussion with them. You'd discuss the primary plan, the secondary plan, backup behavior, and then send them off to do what they're going to do. And you may do the same with a chest tube team, a team that looks after the pelvic injuries. And in this situation, your role as team leader is to foster emergent organization within that group without trying to over-engineer it. That is simply to set up the conditions by which team members can work together towards tangible and manageable objectives. Idea number 3 is ways to factor down complex problems, or take a situation as you currently see it and lead it in a direction more towards what you'd like the situation to look like. Oh, there's Nate. Cool. This is my son Nate, my youngest son. He's 4. He's a handsome dude, right? Yeah. So Nate struggles with his breakfast sometimes because he just wants to go play. He can't see all of the little individual steps between starting his breakfast and finishing his breakfast. He wants to go and play and have fun with his brothers, which usually means beating his brothers over the head with some sort of blunt object or other blunt instrument. And in that circumstance, he can't even get started on his food because he's got this sort of paralysis in action. And so Nate and I just sit there and have a bit of a fight about breakfast and nothing gets accomplished. Then my wife wanders in, and she's much smarter in child rearing and other aspects of life in general. She's here, just ask her, she'll tell you. And she says, okay, Nate, what I need you to do is have 4 bites of your eggs and 2 bites of your toast and drink your juice and you can be done. And guess what? Nate can do that. He can get started on that problem because his mind can constrain the complexity of the issue. It's been factored down to a level that he can appreciate. And your brain works a lot like Nate's brain when it comes to dealing with complex problems. We're hardwired to respond to complexity in one of 2 ways. Either we do a deep dive into features of the problem that seem familiar to us, which leads to fixation, or we try and take the whole problem in at once, which we don't have the cognitive capacity to do. So we take shortcuts, we apply heuristics and rules that may not apply that can create medical error. And good leaders recognize this. They recognize the importance of factoring down from surface complexity a level or 2 so that the problem seems approachable to the team. And there's a tension here between factoring down all the way to the constituent elements of a problem, which would lead to micromanaging in a given situation, and simply factoring down a level or 2 from surface complexities that the problem is more approachable. That, generally speaking, will allow you to explain and explore the vast majority of variables of interest in a given problem, and then identify 1 or 2 specific areas of concern that can become a priority for your team. NASA is an organization that knows a thing or two about complexity, and one of the behaviors they demonstrate in terms of factoring down is the ability to bottom line a problem. Can you take a complex problem in space and summarize it in a sentence? And if you can't, do you really understand the problem that you're trying to address? In emergency medicine, we talk about this a lot. When we talk about residents being able to summarize a case over the phone to another consultant in 3 in the morning in 1 or 2 sentences. If you can't do that, do you really understand the nature of the question that you're asking? So in a situation like our trauma patient, despite all the complexities of the case, I may say to our team, okay, we have a sick patient with a bunch of injuries, but right now we have an airway problem and we have a circulation problem. And then focus our priorities based on those, factoring down only a level or 2 from the surface complexity of the problem. And then finally, your ability to limit variables or constrain chaos. You can't constrain chaos completely, but if you're strategic about it, you can give chaos only a few set paths to take in any one situation, so you have some predictive value even in the most uncertain environments. And this gets back to that concept we mentioned earlier of Kolmogorov complexity. What are really the minimum bits of data that you need to describe a problem or a situation without losing information on that situation? And what this represents in a way is your ability to move from point A to point B in a process or a procedure or a protocol without taking a lot of circuitous or extra steps. And a good example of this is a complex technical procedure. Because it's all fine and good for me to say, in unmedicated upper GI bleeding, if nothing else was working, I'd insert a Blakemore tube. But could I actually do that in my place of work? Do I know where the stuff is? Do I know where all the equipment needs to be? Can I make all the connections? Do I understand all the ports? My suggestion is next time you're at work, pick a procedure or a process or a protocol that you view as complex, and then prove to yourself that you can work through it from A to B. Eliminate those variables or those unknowns before you have to take them on in an actual resuscitation. And then once you do that, make it your habit to do that. Do it again and practice it. Sarah Gray, sitting right behind me, does the same thing, using a toilet paper roll and a scalpel and a calendar alert to practice her surgical airway skills. And once you start looking at processes like that, you can start to figure out whether all the steps are really necessary. Limiting variables means eliminating unnecessary steps. Does your massive transfusion protocol need 16 steps? Can it be 12? Can it be 8? Can it be 4? Can it be 3? And it also means limiting the number of members on your team. I'm going to express an unpopular opinion to you, which is that most teams are too big. And is everyone on your team really contributing? Are they being put to the work as effectively as they can? Or are they just adding to complexity by creating noise and chatter and distraction? If that's the case, eliminate them from the variable. And limiting variables in a team environment also means having a better sense of what your team members actually do. I think there's a pervasive problem in healthcare and really in any other area that involves management and leadership, where leaders and managers don't have a good sense of the talents and the capacities and the strengths and the limitations of the team members that they're supposed to be working with. That's a pretty tall order to call on people to manage a team when you don't really get what your team members are actually capable of, isn't it? See, teams are engineered systems, but they're also social systems. And if you look at a team simply with an engineering mindset, you're likely to be led astray. A good way to get a better sense of what team members' strengths, limitations, and capacities are through cross-training exercises using in situ simulation. So it's not just enough to do the exercise, but make it the focus of an in situ sim exercise to really get a better sense of what your team members are capable of, what their strengths, what their weaknesses are, and also of your own. Not necessarily so you could do their work for them, but so that you can understand their capacities. You can eliminate the variables of their blind spots and their weak points ahead of when you actually have to go into battle with them. And not only does that help you eliminate the variables of performance, but it's also a fantastic way to build team member engagement in an interprofessional setting. Because building engagement is a wonderful way to get your team engaged in solving complex problems. Because after all, a team really shouldn't be a team leader dictating instructions to its team members. It should be a group of interprofessionals all motivated and devoted towards solving a complex problem. That's what interprofessionalism is really good at, and that's how you solve the really challenging problems in a team environment. All right, I have to say that these problems and these habits can become sort of habit-forming in themselves in my work life and in my life. When I look at a problem in my real life or the real world that matters to me, like climate change or global warming, that can be a pretty daunting thing to take on. I can't solve that problem as much as it has meaning to me and as much as I'd like to be able to do so. It's too big. But I can ride my bike to work every day. I can drive my car less. I could trip stack. I can start to take these smaller incremental steps that over time make you more and more empowered towards solving bigger and more complex problems. And that's not to say you shouldn't dream big, because you should, but it's also important to understand these smaller, more elemental and incremental steps that are going to get you there a bit faster and more consistently. So let's go back to our case. How do we manage complexity here? Well, first, we leaned on habit. So in our primary trauma survey, we approached that patient like a hypotensive trauma patient. We didn't make any major variances to our initial approach, and that allowed us not to miss anything that was common or deadly. We then worked on fostering emergence by breaking our team up into sub-teams, and those sub-teams worked semi-autonomously for periods of time during the resuscitation towards specific, achievable, and manageable goals. We factored down the problem fairly significantly. Once the resuscitation got rolling, it became fairly obvious this was going to be a really challenging airway case. And so we really just declared that to the team and focused that as our sole objective for a set period of time, despite all the other complexities of the case. And then limiting variables, we were fortunate at our institution, well in advance of this case, that we'd invested the effort in developing a streamlined Bougie-Crike surgical airway kit that was hanging on the wall about 3 feet from the patient's head. And it has a minimum amount of equipment in it and a minimum number of steps, and everyone in that room had a mental model of what those steps looked like. So when it came time to perform a surgical airway on this patient, it went about as smoothly as possible given the very challenging circumstances. So you have a choice. You can either choose to rein in complexity and chaos once it already happens, or you can make the upfront investment in cognitive and behavioral strategies that will constrain and manage that complexity and help you solve problems. I know that's not everything. I know everyone out here has their own hacks for dealing with complexity. So let's keep the conversation going. Shout at me on the Twitter machine, and let's help each other out in working through this really complex world of ours. Dream big, but plan simple. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. That was fabulous. I'm going to turn over to Haney for comments or questions.
Yeah, there were a lot of great discussions about organizing the team, talks about simplifying the complex. There was one request for the butt cheek sound again.
If the mic's on. What sort of fidelity you want on that demonstration? I'll simulate it because that's what I do best.
There you go, good. The one question we had was, what do you do in an acute situation where someone joins the team after it's been discussed about organization? Maybe it's a consultant, maybe it's a new member to the team. How do you get them involved in that mindset during the acute resuscitation?
I'm borrowing from Cliff Reed's philosophy on this of giving useless people a job, which is, I think, important. So the first thing I try and do when something complex is underway and somebody shows up is I try and thank them for being there. Say, thank you for coming. This is a challenging situation. We already have a few things underway. And then if we're in that organizational structure of sub-teams where we're working in smaller groups, I'll try and put that person into a specific group with a brief explanation of why. So what we really need you to work on right now is helping bring the sheet across to put a pelvic binder on. Integrating somebody into a complex scenario, trying to get them oriented to the entire picture right away is a real challenge. And sometimes it's better to keep people somewhat task-focused and task-oriented, limiting their sense of situation awareness, at least initially, and then over time, broadening their sense of what's going on as you gain a better understanding of it as well.
Thank you.